If there are no further points of order, we come now to the main business, the backbench debate on mental health. At this stage, there is no time limit on backbench contributions. Let's see how it goes. To open the debate, I call Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. And it's my privilege this afternoon to move the motion before the House that this House has considered the matter of mental health. I'm particularly grateful to all the members, both old and new, of the Backbench Business Committee for allocating time for this debate in the Chamber. The efforts to secure this debate have been very much jointly done with the honourable member for my honourable friend for Broxbourne, who is chairman and has led it so well, chairman of the all-party group on mental health, plus members for Worthing West, Dagenham and Rainham, Foyle, New Forest East and Hales Owen and Rowley Regis. I hope I pronounced that last constituency correctly. We were quite clear when we were putting in our bid for this debate that we wanted a full debate on the main floor of the House of Commons chamber. Well, why was that? It is at least 4 years, and I think probably slightly longer, since the general topic of mental health has been debated in the chamber. That is a long time, given that 25% of the population, that's 1 in 4 people, will experience a mental health problem at some point in their lives. Imagine if this were a physical health condition and that had not been talked about in the House of Commons or by the members of the House of Commons, other than very specific ways in adjournment debates, for a very long time. Mental health comes at an economic and social cost to the UK economy of £105 billion a year. And yet mental health has been a Cinderella service, poorly funded compared to other conditions, and not spoken about nearly enough, either inside this House or outside. It is the largest single cause of disability within the NHS, 23% of the disease burden in the NHS, and yet the NHS spends only 11% of its annual budget on mental health problems. According to the Centre for Mental Health, and I was really quite upset when I read this statistic. Yes, of course.
Would the Honourable Lady also agree that it's not only the effects on individuals in terms of mental health, but because of mental health actually then leads to some physical disabilities, there's actually an extra cost to the NHS as well?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman very much indeed for his intervention, and I entirely agree with him. I think the Centre for Mental Health has shown that a person who has both a physical health and a mental health condition, the costs of their treatment are increased by 45% because of the additional costs around their mental health needs, which are often go untreated initially and then are treated at a later stage. So he is absolutely right. According to the Centre for Mental Health, only a quarter of people, children as well as adults, with a mental health condition get any treatment for that condition. And if that statistic, and I have no reason to doubt, I entirely believe the Centre for Mental Health that statistic is right, then that is absolutely shocking that 3/4 of people who have mental health conditions are not getting treatment for that condition. And we should be asking ourselves why that is. Recent figures show that depression alone is costing the economy £10 billion a year, and we all know that we don't have a lot of money to spend, so we should be doing everything we possibly can to work on preventative measures. £1 in every £8 spent on long-term conditions is linked to poor mental health, equating to £8 to £13 billion between £8 and £13 billion of NHS spending each year. I welcome the Health and Social Care Act, and I hope that this afternoon's debate is going to be conducted on pretty non-partisan terms, but I realise that could be a controversial comment for me to say to members on the opposite side of the House. But I do welcome the Health and Social Care Act, opportunities it brings for commissioning of mental health services. But I particularly welcome, I did speak on the third reading debate of that Act, the amendment that the government accepted, that came from the other place, that the government accepted to ensure parity between physical and mental health. Because although they are only words on the face of a bill, they are very important words, and they send a very clear signal, I think, both to mental health sufferers and to their families and to those working within the NHS. And I hope that the Secretary of State will ensure in his annual mandate to the National Commissioning Board that the National Commissioning Board should prioritise mental health. Well, how to achieve parity? It is about money, certainly, but it is also about awareness. Confessing to having a mental health condition carries far too much stigma. And that's part of the reasoning behind having today's debate on the floor of the main House of Commons chamber. Because if we don't start to talk about mental health and encourage in this place and encourage others to talk about it, how can we expect to to enable people to confront their problems? What's been quite interesting in preparing these debates is the fact that a few people have said to me, yes, go ahead, mention my name. And then they've thought about it for a couple of days, and then they've come back to me and said, actually, I'd rather you didn't. I haven't told my employer. I haven't necessarily told all my friends and my family. So there is still very much a stigma around having a mental health condition. Admitting that you've been sectioned is apparently, well, it is traumatic, particularly when it appears on CRB checks when you're applying for jobs. So I welcome the work of Time to Change, which has been partly funded by the Department of Health as well as Comic Relief, and also the Sunday Express campaign on mental health. But destigmatisation of mental health conditions is down to all of us, particularly those of us as employers, to not discriminate against people who tell us that they do have a mental health condition who might be working for us. So I hope that today's debate is another firm step on the path to ensuring mental health is destigmatised. And without that destigmatisation, I think that successful treatment is going to be very hard for a person to achieve. We also asked for today's debate to be kept deliberately general, so that members on all sides could raise many different issues on behalf of their constituents, as well as perhaps themselves or their families, as well as looking at mental health policy landscape. Mental ill health is no respecter of age or background. It can strike anyone, often very unexpectedly. And this includes people in senior positions such as members of Parliament, company directors and school governors. And I feel sure that my honourable friend, the member for Croydon Central, is going to be talking about the private members' bill he'll be bringing forward to end discrimination against people in those positions who have mental health conditions. I expect that we're going to hear this afternoon about new mums with postnatal depression, a time of life that should be one of the happiest, often one of the most difficult. And I welcome the recent government announcement to ensure that health visitors are properly trained to recognise signs of postnatal depression, long overdue in my opinion. I expect we're going to hear about veterans from our armed forces who suffer with mental health conditions, older people suffering from dementia, and there are of course particular issues affecting our black and minority ethnic communities, as well as those who find themselves within the criminal justice system. I'm sure that we will hear from the Minister about the government's widely welcomed framework, No Health Without Mental Health, which was published last year, but we are now waiting for that detailed implementation plan which the Department of Health is working on alongside leading mental health charities. I want to talk very briefly, I've taken note of Mr Speaker's strictures about time limits, for three particular areas. I want to talk about listening to patients, integrated care, as well as the wider mental health wellbeing landscape. In terms of listening to patients, we made it clear in the course of the Health and Social Care Act that one of the things we wanted to see as a government was no decision about me without me. That means patients having a voice in their care. And it seems to me from my discussion with those within the mental health system who have been sufferers, that often once the initial crisis is dealt with, they do want choice, they want involvement in their treatment. They are facing a lifetime condition. They are going to have to self-medicate and look after themselves and spot their condition and when they're deteriorating, when they're potentially reaching a crisis point for years and years to come. And they want a voice. They want to be heard by the healthcare professionals. And I think it's up to us as a government to help them to achieve that. According to Mind... Yes, of course.
Did you suggest that people who suffer with mental health problems have a lifelong condition? I think many people have an occasional mental health problem.
Well, I thank Honourable very much indeed for that condition, for his intervention. I'm not sure that I would necessarily agree with him. He's quite right that obviously people come into the system often at a time of crisis, so they'll have one episode. But often people will actually have episodes, they'll get better, they may have years of uninterrupted, no problems at all. He's shaking his head, but I can tell him from the personal experiences of constituents and family members that they can go in and out of the system. And actually one of the hardest things for people to accept when they're diagnosed with a mental health condition is that they're going to be on drugs for years and years to come. And that's actually it is a difficult thing to often to admit, particularly when you're striking up perhaps a new relationship or you're working for a new employer. And I think that's why people want to have a voice about the way that they're being treated. According to Mind, people are 3 times more likely to be satisfied with their treatment if they are presented with a choice of treatments. And failing to stay on medication is the main cause of relapses when people have to re-enter the system, often at a time of crisis. There is a need to work with and trust health professionals. There was a recent University of Kent study which could be summarised as saying that low levels of trust between mental health patients and professionals can lead to poor communication, which generates negative outcomes for patients, including a further undermining of trust. And trust can play a significant role in facilitating service users' initial and ongoing engagement with services, the openness of their communication, and the level of cooperation with and outcomes from their treatment and medication. A Care Quality Commission mental health inpatient survey in 2009 revealed that in some mental health trusts, as few as 40% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia felt they were involved as much as they wanted to be in decisions about their care and treatment. Now, I'm no health professional. I hope that some people who are health professionals are going to be speaking this afternoon. But from what people have said to me, medication is not always the answer, certainly not on a long-term basis. Platform 51 did some research which showed that the use of antidepressants, a quarter of women have been on antidepressants for 10 years or more. Half of women on antidepressants were not offered alternatives at the time of prescription, and a quarter of women on antidepressants have waited a year or more for a review of their medication. I welcome the government's investment of £400 million in IAP treatments. I think, to be fair, that builds on announcements made by the previous government, and I would commend the Centre for Social Justice report on talking therapies, which calls for broadening out of therapies. Every patient is different, and they will all respond differently to different medications and different therapies. Mental health patients must have real choice, and I think that the extension of any qualified provider and payment by results to them must be done in a way that it is being extended to patients with physical health conditions. And finally, we've got to ensure that patients' voices are heard within the management structures of both clinical commissioning groups and on health and wellbeing boards, whose job it is to hold services to account for the care that they are giving. I expect we're going to hear from honourable members this afternoon about integrated care, the need for all services to work together. Poor mental health has an impact on every area of government policy: healthcare, benefits, housing and debt, social exclusion, business employment, criminal justice and education, just to name some. So one person with mental health condition can need help from a lot of different agencies, but too often that care is not joined up. And every agency just deals with their own bit and passes somebody on, or sometimes there is no follow-up and somebody just gets lost in the system. In a 2011 survey, 45% of people contacted by Mind told them that they had had 8 or more assessments with different agencies in 1 year. Young Minds, which campaigns for children and young people with mental health condition, has called for one worker for each child needing support for their mental health in order to avoid multiple assessments and having to retell their story every time they see a new person within the system. But there has to be a clear care pathway, however, and it must be clear at whatever point the mental health system is accessed. The other thing that patients are calling for is the ability to be able to self-refer. We need to do all we can to prevent people reaching crisis point, and often it's the patients themselves who are able to tell when they are about to reach crisis point. My own West Leicestershire Clinical Commissioning Care Group is developing an acute care pathway in partnership with Leicestershire Partnership Trust, and it plans to replace the many and varied access routes to secondary care mental health services and provide one single access point to give us speedy access at time of greatest need. And that's come from both patient feedback and GP feedback. Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I congratulate her on securing this debate. I'm very interested in the point she makes about having a single threshold through which service users can access the service. Would she agree with me that, as well as acute services, non-acute services could be assisted by having a single point of access in terms of well-being provision? And I think that the term well-being needs to be emphasised here as part of improved and enhanced mental health provision.
I thank my honourable friend very much indeed for his intervention. He's absolutely right. I'm going to come on to talk about well-being just in a moment, but he is right. We often talk about this in very negative ways, and actually if we were all to talk about our own mental health well-being and to be asked about it when we go to see our GPs on a more regular basis, I think that would help a lot with the destigmatisation, which I talked about at the beginning of my speech. So I entirely agree with what he's saying. I wanted to touch very briefly on secondary care. The Sunday Express campaign, one of the campaign asks is that all hospitals should be therapeutic environments where people with mental health problems are treated with respect, have someone to talk to, and they feel safe. Now, in a previous debate in this House in November last year, I mentioned patients who have absconded from secondary care units, and in particular the tragic case of Kirsty Brooks my constituent who was able to escape from a unit in Leicester and subsequently hanged herself. I'm sure the Minister will remember that debate and the debate that we had around the definitions of absconding. I still feel that despite the CQC has published its first report on absconding levels, I welcome that. I still think there is some, it's unclear of the picture of absconding and escape numbers. So I think those numbers the CQC provided in their first report do need to be broken down further, but it did show there were, in the year they reported, I think 2009-10, 4,321 instances of absence without leave from secondary care. Some, of course, far more serious than others. Some of them relate to somebody missing a bus on the way back to the unit, some of them ending in tragic circumstances. This is not to beat up on secondary care providers and health providers generally, but only by knowing the scale of a problem can we actually begin to tackle it. The impact of the voluntary and community sector on mental health must not be forgotten. I hope that honourable members will mention that this afternoon. They offer vital support and they must be part of the commissioning landscape. In the run-up to debate, I've received this... Yes, of course.
Member for giving way and congratulate her on getting the debate today. It's very welcome. One of the problems, I'm sure she'd agree, is that the smaller, very involved voluntary sector organisations that do give a very good service and do understand their communities, under the commissioning process, often lose out to very large enterprises, very large charities, or very large medical companies who have no real understanding or sensitivity of a local community, particularly an ethnic minority community, that local charities might know better. Does she not think the Minister needs to think a little bit more about this?
I thank him very much indeed, and I do agree with him. I think there is an issue here, and that's why I hope that the changes in the commissioning structures, where you've got local GPs very much deciding which care and where from they're going to buy, would allow them to explore the value that these smaller organisations, which is, as the honourable gentleman says, know the people that they're treating well, the real value that they can bring. And although they might not have sometimes the weight and the clout of large organisations, actually they will ultimately be more successful. So I entirely agree with what he said, and I'm sure that the Minister has heard him. And he brings me very nicely onto a point. I wanted to thank in particular one of my regular correspondents, Mike Crump, who I think may well be in the public gallery this afternoon, from My Time, which is a community interest company based in the West Midlands that provides evidence-based, culturally sensitive professional counselling and support services. And he said to me, a great deal of his recovery is owed to therapies based on common sense, not the miraculous powers of a tablet or the mysterious wonders of the medical profession. I want to touch very briefly on policing, because my Chief Constable in Leicestershire is also the Association of Chief Police Officers mental health lead. And in Leicestershire in 2011-12, there were 444 detentions under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act. That's when somebody has to be taken to a place of safety. Leicestershire Police deal with serious incidents around mental health issues on a daily basis. And they provided me with a snapshot of what had happened on the Jubilee weekend. So from 8 p.m. one night to 7 a.m. the next morning, they had dealt in Leicestershire with 10 incidents in which mental health conditions or concerns were clearly very prevalent. And I just want to ask whether the police are the right people to be dealing with all these instances, in particular the 4 hours which the police in Leicestershire spent on that night with a man in hospital after he was detained under Section 136. The next stage, of course, is the criminal justice system. I hope some members might talk about the criminal justice system and the fact that 9 out of 10 prisoners in our prisons have a mental health condition. And the government is investing over £19 million this year on diversion services, but it's still taking too long to get prisoners out of prison and into secure mental hospitals. Finally, I want to touch very briefly on the mental wellbeing landscape, which I have already been mentioned, and I thank you for the intervention on that. All of us have mental health. It's just that some people's is better than others. And we need to get to a situation where talking about our mental well-being is as normal as talking about our physical well-being. But public health is very much a part of this. Public health now sitting within local authorities, key to good mental health locally. I also wanted to welcome the Leicestershire Joint Strategic Needs Assessment chapter on mental health published recently, which makes it clear how important mental health is. But it also goes on to say mental health cannot be seen in isolation. There are many things that contribute to mental ill health. One of them, of course, is the current economic instability. I'm sure we're going to hear about that this afternoon. In particular as well, changes on welfare reform, asking people whether they are in fact fit enough to go back to work. I think those questions do need to be asked, but I would like to thank my constituent Jo Gibbs, who brought me a letter recently outlining her concerns about these changes and the anxiety and pressure that they are causing her and others. Yes, of course I will.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way because, and congratulate her not only on securing the debate but on her wide-ranging speech. But the point that she's just touching on welfare reform, and I wonder if she shares my concern that people with mental health issues are actually are being kicked off sort of disability support allowance, and certainly I've had an increasing number of people coming to me who are not getting employment support payments. A recent constituent came with bipolar on the Asperger's spectrum and scored 0 on the scoring process.
I thank the Honourable Lady very much indeed for her intervention. I'm sure we're all going to have constituency cases along the same lines. There's no doubt. As I said, I think it's right because actually the Mind survey says that most people with mental health problems want to work, but they may not be well enough. So actually, for some people, employment actually, once they're better, employment is the right way forward, the right employment with the right employer and the right supportive environment. But of course, for some people, employment isn't going to be the answer. And I think she's absolutely right to say that within the assessments, there have sometimes been people obviously doing the assessments perhaps who haven't understood the mental health needs of the people that are in front of them. I do think the government has tried to address that through the 2 Harrington reviews. The system's never going to be perfect, and I guess that's where members of Parliament will come in, because we'll be arguing the cases on behalf of our constituents. But I do understand very much the point she's making. I'm sure that other honourable members will share in the concerns that she and I have both expressed. And I think we do need to do more and to keep up awareness of these issues and the way the assessments are working. There are other things in modern life which don't help. Loneliness and isolation. We live in a busier world than ever, but actually people live more isolated lives. And we mustn't forget families. Often families are the source of pressure and the source of ill health, but they can also be the road to recovery. And that's why sometimes actually when people go home, they need to know that they're going to have families and carers looking after them. I would commend the Centre for Social Justice and all the work they've done and their report, Completing the Revolution, about the importance of families and really how important family breakdown is in understanding problems such as mental health and mental well-being. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this is an important debate, but it's only one step along the path of giving mental health the priority which I feel, and I think honourable members, because there's a sizable number of honourable members here today, feel that it must have. I look forward to hearing the views of other members from across the House. I think we need to talk about mental health far more openly, and we need to make it much easier for people to find out information about how they get help before they need it. It's too late when people reach a crisis point. I look forward very much to seeing the implementation framework of No Health Without Mental Health, and I think at that point we've got to stop talking, although talking must never stop completely, but we've got to start implementing. And I'd particularly like to thank everybody who has contacted me in the run-up to this debate and shared their stories, often very personal stories, with me about the experiences they and members of their family have had within the mental health system. Sometimes this House of Commons chamber is too well known for bad behaviour and all of us shouting at each other. But I hope today shows that we're about more than that. And I hope that we can all agree with the motion that mental health is a huge priority for Britain and for our constituents, whether they are sufferers or carers, and that by working together we can come up with that integrated care which listens to and responds to the needs of patients and gives our mental well-being the prominence it so richly merits. Thank you.
Order. The question is as on the order paper. Mr. Kevin Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I